Good morning and welcome to day 3. I had a slight scare this morning because I forgot my notes here and realized an hour ago. So I've relied on my memory to replay yesterday's talks and presentations. So those of you who are joining us just today for the first time, we usually go through just recollecting some of the key points and commitments expressed by the participants, and also then draw together the different participants' experiences through conversation at the end of the day. So yesterday we began with Devika Singh, who is Curator of International Art at Tate. And she, through her research practice, her training as an art historian, and her recent curatorial projects, was really looking through how the artist has been central to networks of internationalism and cosmopolitan lineages, also looking at what decolonial art history for South Asian modernism can look like through exhibition practice, looking at various flows of migration and composite identities, to also then investigate what Western art history presents to us as a canonized framework, to instead narrate between European and non-European centers the kind of mutual directions of experience that also an influence that reject the idea of, say, derived knowledge within artistic practices, and embrace an hybrid aesthetics. Her exhibition Planetary Planning explored how artistic itinerancy has challenged fixed identities and their inherent hierarchies. It included the Japanese-American sculptor Isamu Noguchi capturing the Jantar Mantar, but also the phenomenal Bangladeshi artist Kibriya, who used Japanese cultural principles in the textures for his abstract compositions. And this was an exhibition that took place at the Dhaka Art Summit. Further, I mean, my one sort of little bit to add here is really a question which I think Devika did address in her exhibition, but also just how to consider the potential of the planetary beyond the algorithmic liquidity of the global that is leading to maximizing divisiveness and extractivism in late capitalism. Her second example was from Homelands, which is at Kettle's Yard. It's an ongoing exhibition. And she walked us through the exhibition generously and talked about artists such as Nikhil Chopra, with whom she realized a sort of installation that came from his contribution to the Havana Biennale, and then he will perform in 2 days' time Rouge, which is a piece linked to that installation. She also has been working with Seher Shah as part of both her recent exhibitions, Bani Abedi with an older work, News, and Munem Wasif with really what feels like an important new work in which he's tracing the personal stories of the Rohingya community. Iftikhar and Elizabeth Dadi also kind of foregrounding her exhibition Homelands. Sohrab Hurra's work, Snow, recalling Kashmir's hidden protagonists and the everyday dystopia and resistance amidst what is projected as a bucolic landscape. We further also just informally discussed what it means to broaden notions of South Asia through being more vigilant about categories of inclusion, hegemonic neighbors, and exclusions. So hopefully we take up more of those points also for discussion. We then had Paz Guevara, who joined us from Berlin, from the House of World Cultures. And she started by looking at two projects within a long-term project called Canon Fragen, Canon Questions at the House of World Cultures, and led by the Visual Arts and Film Department Director Ansam Franke. The Canon Fragen asks really questions around the formation and circulation of canonized modernity, and then thinks about these as a history of limits, and looks also closely at the kind of colonial appropriations that still ensue in this regard of the building and the unmaking of canons. One of the major projects in this effort was Parapolitics, Cultural Freedom and the Cold War, also done as a group jointly curated effort. And it was a massively researched endeavor, really looking through almost sort of 200 conferences and traveling exhibitions that were funded by a division of the CIA. And then making us sort of realize how embedded we are by these alternative networks of surveillance and security powers, such as the CIA. There are many others. And how Cold War lineage may be approached through histories of cultural diplomacy and interdependence. So no matter how much we resist, there's also this great amnesia about to what extent certain journals as well that Paz showed us, like Quest, like other journals around solidarity building in Philippines, Transition Journal in South Africa, have all actually had this sort of undercurrent of funding and influence by a body like the CIA, and have therefore, in a way, both defined and contaminated ideas of internationalism. One of the points that I found as a curator really quite relevant to point toward is also that this exhibition, which was designed by Zach Krupp, really thought through the idea of the exhibition as medium and studied what the physical architecture of these exhibitions funded by CIA, among others, through the Cold War, also one that came to New Delhi with Clement Greenberg, etc., what the physicality of these exhibitions looked like. And when they actually create an exhibition to interpret these histories, what that physical architecture would look like. And so they used certain incomplete elements, used steel and used translucent walls. So also looking at this idea of transparency and opacity of information and knowledge gathering. And apart from that, a really important recent project, Afrosonic Mapping, was led by musician and artist Satch Hoyt, which Paz fully worked on, really. And that exhibition looks at the oral and sonic histories of the African diaspora, and also the kind of ways in which the ethnographic museums trap sound histories and sound movements, and how the kind of these samples of sound in music can then travel back to the cultures in which they have originated, or in which there has been sort of a forced migration of those acoustics. So he used these earliest recordings from the Berlin Ethnological Museum, and then shared them with musicians and MCs in Luanda, in Salvador de Bahia, and Lisbon, and therefore also talking about histories of the Atlantic Ocean, the slave trade, and colonialism. The exhibition itself included paintings that are sort of literal notations for the improvised music concerts that take place in their midst. So the paintings were sort of arranged as a floating auditorium, the physicality of the sort of Afrofuturist idea of a spaceship. So you had these improvised jazz compositions, sound samples coming from the archive, and also through recordings that Satch Hoyt did in these various locations, all kind of coming together at the Hakave, again, as part of the Kanon Fragen exhibition. Then after lunch, we had Tarun Nagesh speaking to us about the history of the Asia Pacific Triennale, really from the second and third editions, with seminal Indian artists and South Asian and Southeast Asian artists as well. But some of the ones that he initially pointed out to, who also sort of someone like Pranalini Mukherjee, who is no longer among us, and the kind of importance of showing work by her, by Nalini Malani, by Nilima Sheikh, among many others, and then what it meant also for practices from Myanmar, from Cambodia, Vietnam, to have been shown there, to be commissioned and to be exhibited within the museum, and through that expand ideas of the Asia Pacific. Also, when further questioned also through Zoe, who has been part of the APT in its early iterations, also the fact that the Asia Pacific has been and will be geopolitically redefined at every stage. So what does it mean for a triennale to respond to that and to also resist perhaps those definitions as they form along the way, and what it means also for this sort of living history of exhibitions really to be investigated by those working within these institutions, but then also be accessed internationally by the publics who are also the point from are the ones who actually can testify to these histories of production and cultural agency. So that was one part of the presentation, but also Tarun, what very importantly, what he highlighted was really also the ethics of participation and collaboration, particularly in relation to Aboriginal artists from Australia, but also from other parts, from the Pacific, and the fact that there can be often very problematic views when an international artist feels as though he or she might just come along and because they have an invitation from Australia, sort of out of a sense of I don't know, some sort of feeling of camaraderie or generosity, consider that they can actually enter these Aboriginal communities. And yet what APT has really stood firmly for is to think about how to narrativize and present these histories and these communal realities, also the kind of ongoing injustice and violence for those communities within an institutional practice. And some of the relevant examples also of how to create exhibitions or exhibits for indigenous vocabularies within a triennale, so that there is a place in which those stories and those material methodologies can really find a ground, not perhaps be lost in a bunch of sort of large-scale installations without context. I feel like that might round things up. Okay, and the last presenter from yesterday is Nantara Gurungakshpati, and she spoke to us also about how through various models that have been conceived by her and her colleagues in Nepal, like Photo Circle, Photo Kathmandu, and more recent efforts such as the Feminist Memory Project, are really trying to think about mixed models of funding and survival for such sort of non-institutional, non-profit practices, what it means to then build regional networks through efforts such as the festival, and to really represent image building practices from Nepal. And the Feminist Memory Project was something that I was personally just really glad to come across through when Nantara was at Coach Curatorial Intensive, and she at that point, I remember initially thought of it as calling a segment of it the public life of women, which is a really also kind of quite an astute title on what it means for these to have this sort of inventory of several key women figures from Nepal, some of whom have been working for women's rights for decades, have led Dalit initiatives, are also in politics today. What does it mean to really think about this sort of private public life of women? And what does it mean to activate this kind of visual archive that also comes with various letters, documents, and so on, that have a sort of private significance too. She, through that, has also been thinking about new strategies for alliance building and public mobilization, gatherings, taking inspiration from the women, the way they gathered in large numbers before digital tools arrived, but then also taking it forward through her projects such as Imperfect Solidarities, which also involves narrative approaches, working with psychotherapy, open source learning, looking at gatherings that involve deep dialogue to arrive at a sense of co-evilness, but not necessarily agreement. What does it mean to also think about ecology and landscape in relation to such gatherings, and develop an intersectional approach that also speaks to this ecology? And what does it mean to deal with intergenerational conflicts, perhaps, in searching for lines of solidarity? Okay, and the last part of the presentation also looked at something that we all hope and feel a sense of optimism for, I guess, from the response we got, towards tackling the question of sexual violence and discrimination in the art scene and the cultural scenes that we all come from and belong to in its very specific ways. Each cultural scene also needs to find its own, let's not call them solutions, but just, again, deeper practices of ethics and accountability, and come together in these different modes intergenerationally, looking not only at sexual violence but discrimination, and through caste, race, sex, disability, ethnicity, and so on. Then Nayantara shared her very practical examples of how she and her colleagues have dealt with this question, and facilitated dialogue, and not as confrontation, but really, again, as finding a measure for accountability and creating collective forums that involve various kinds of cultural workers, legal advisors, and so on, to make it a space at least of acknowledgement, if not reconciliation. On that note, there's this very short quote that when we was coming to the end of the day that I thought of, by Arundhati Roy, who said, it's very simple but kind of eloquent, which is, another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I hear her breathing. And this very simple line, it just sort of made me think about how we are all situated amongst a sense of mounting grief and disenchantment, but also radical hope, perhaps, for what is going on amidst us. Thank you. I now want to introduce the first speaker for today, Lydia Yee. And Lydia has been chief curator at Whitechapel Gallery since 2015, and more recently curated Is This Tomorrow 2019, which I'm really keen to ask her more about. But also exhibitions by Ulla von Brandenburg, Leonor Antunes, Mary Hallman, and several others. She has worked as curator at the Barbican Art Gallery, and also led really major exhibitions there that included working with Trisha Brown, Laurie Anderson, Gordon Meta-Clark, and has also previously to that worked as senior curator at the Bronx Museum of Arts in New York. Welcome, Lydia.
And hopefully there'll also be time to talk about a more recent exhibition, Is This Tomorrow? And I think this group of projects explores quite a range of scales, both time and financially, and spatially. So the two institutions that I'm going to focus on, Barbican and Whitechapel, are of a very different nature. And I'll give brief introductions to both. So yes, time, scale, and also hopefully pulling back the curtain a little bit at some of the kind of organizational principles and the motivations for certain decision making, and maybe a little bit about funding. I hope to cover. So first, maybe could we go to the web link for the Freeze page? So one of the things that isn't maybe apparent from my bio is that I came of age during a moment in time when curators were largely not trained in curatorial studies programs. I studied art history, and I also attended the Whitney Museum of American Art Independent Study Program, which is a kind of critical studies program in New York. Both my academic training and the Whitney program were quite theory heavy, although the CUNY Graduate Center, where I did my graduate work in art history, is also quite object focused and really emphasizing close looking and historical research. So maybe I have, oscillate between those poles. One of the things, and the Whitney Independent Study Program maybe started out in some ways more like a curatorial studies program. I was struck by one of the first things that Hal Foster, who was then leading the program, said. He said, "Come up with a great idea, don't worry about the art, we can commission it." So in some ways, you know, I had a bit of experience. I had already done an internship at the New Museum, and it sounded quite strange to me that you could start from that end rather than from looking and talking to artists. This 2019 is the 100th anniversary of the Bauhaus, and can we scroll down? I also co-curate the talks program at Frieze London. In this past October, I co-curated the program with Matthew McLean, who's a senior editor at Frieze, and we decided to focus on the Bauhaus, not only because it's its centenary, but also we felt like many of the ideas and issues at stake resonated with the current moment. So we could maybe go down to the schedule. The talks were scheduled, organized around a number of themes that were apparent or part of the Bauhaus's history, but also, I think, very much connected to today. So the first session focused on the kind of rise of the right and how that's impacted cultural organizations around the world, focusing on Brazil, but also Turkey and Britain. The Bauhaus, as I'll explain, was forced to close because of pressures during the National Socialist period in Germany. We also looked at art school education today and had a number of speakers who, from different perspectives, and their approach to arts education, which is the Bauhaus, as many of you might know, was an important art school in Germany. And then also to kind of flip the issues of gender on their head, we had a conversation with a female architect and a male weaver. And these are also two things that would have been very rare during the Bauhaus period, but also surprisingly are kind of rare today still. And then lastly, we ended with a session about performance, and particularly invited the participants of the Lithuanian Pavilion to talk about their project, Sun Sea Marina, which was at the Venice Biennale, I think just closed. And ironically, or perhaps presciently, it was a project about climate change, and Venice on the past couple of weekends was flooded because of rising waters. So now to go to the formal presentation or informal presentation. I wanted to first start with the Bauhaus Artist Life exhibition. It took place at the Barbican Center in 2012. And the Barbican is a multi-art center with art galleries, cinemas, a major concert hall, and theaters. So it is a non-collecting institution, but presents many art forms. It's funded and owned by the City of London, so it has healthy public support, but it also relies quite heavily, I think, on ticket income and corporate support. I think the center actually has few major individual supporters. It's much more corporate members and corporate sponsors. It's located in the heart of the City of London, which is the financial and business district. And it's also part of a major brutalist housing estate that was designed and built in the late 60s and early 70s. So this concrete architecture is a very prominent feature. I have control of this. Okay. So this is the entry to the exhibition Bauhaus Artist Life. The exhibition space is a double-height gallery with a suite of spaces on the upper level overlooking a big kind of open space on the lower level. The exhibition was organized around these 10 themes, and I'll walk you through them and talk about some of the works and hopefully raise some of the issues around the exhibition. So here's an installation view, and you can kind of see the upper level walkways. So there's this kind of view from above, and also from the ground level, you can also see up to some degree. Bauhaus Artist Life was initiated as a part of a collaboration with the Weimar Klassik Stiftung, the Stiftung Bauhaus in Dessau, and also the Berlin Bauhaus Archive. And these are the three major German Bauhaus institutions, and also they're very much associated with moments in the school's history, and two of them occupy buildings that the Bauhaus previously was situated in. It was also a moment when these organizations first started collaborating. A couple years earlier, they had mounted, in collaboration with the Museum of Modern Art, a major exhibition, which was intended initially to be a traveling exhibition, and the Barbican was going to be part of that tour. But for various reasons, quite early on in the organization of the tour, I think MoMA and the Bauhaus organizations had a falling out, or not so much MoMA, but MoMA and the Martin Gropius Bau, where the exhibition was due to be presented. They had two radically different ideas of what the Bauhaus should be about. And ultimately, I think this in some ways freed each institution up to organize their own show out of the same group of potential objects. In Berlin at the Martin Gropius Bau, obviously Germany, and has a huge stake in the history of the Bauhaus, they presented a show called The Bauhaus, a Conceptual Model. And it was really in some ways to talk about the Bauhaus's legacy, both as a kind of school to some degree, but much more so as a kind of commercial entity, and ultimately a brand that has been distributed and circulated internationally. MoMA, in that same year, mounted an exhibition called Bauhaus 1919 to 1933 Workshops of Modernity. And MoMA's history is very much tied up with the Bauhaus. Founded in 1929, Alfred Barr, who was then the founding director of the Museum of Modern Art, traveled to Dessau to experience the Bauhaus. And he said it was one of the 3 days that had the biggest impact on his educational life. And then the following year, MoMA would open. And like the Bauhaus, which separated the various kind of artistic practices into disciplines, mural painting, for example, a design, performance. MoMA was set up and structured like this by department. So when it came time for the Barbican to kind of take on this tour, there was no tour anymore because there was not an agreement about the works or what kind of exhibition it should be. But this gave us, in some ways, a tremendous opportunity to make a new show that made sense for British audiences or European audiences. I co-curated the show with Catherine Ince, who is now at the V&A East as the chief curator there. But she's a design specialist, and my background is in art. Not so much modern art, although I've, over the years, worked on a number of modern exhibitions as well. But it was a really kind of interesting way to work across different disciplines. And I always find very much co-curating to be a very rewarding experience. Sometimes it makes the process much more complicated, but it also makes it that much more rewarding. So the exhibition was divided into 10 sections. The beginning section, the first one called New Beginnings, opened with Walter Gropius's manifesto and program for the Bauhaus. He founded the school in 1919 out of two existing schools that had closed prior to the war. With new funding, Gropius was able to merge these two schools in Weimar. One was an arts and crafts school, and the other one was a fine arts academy to form the Bauhaus. And Gropius was an architect and wanted very much so to form an architecture program, but I think because he was an architect, he thought that it wouldn't be possible immediately to make an architecture school. He brought together the arts and crafts, and the underpinnings of the Bauhaus, as you can see from these two extracts from the manifesto, were about how the arts could work together. Could there be a synthesis between architecture and painting and sculpture, for example? And they pointed to the Gothic cathedral builders as perhaps the kind of pinnacle of this collaboration between art and architecture. I think the other thing that was key to the Bauhaus's manifesto and mission was that crafts and fine arts would not be separated, or there wouldn't be a hierarchy anymore, because he was merging these two schools, but he also believed very much that handicraft was important to artists. The cover of the manifesto maybe brings together some of the kind of issues. It's a woodcut by Lionel Feininger, who's a painter, or was a painter, and the woodcut features a Gothic cathedral, and also woodcut is quite an old technique. It wouldn't have been a very kind of contemporary technique at the time. So this is Gropius's curriculum for the Bauhaus. It was a program in which the preliminary course in the outer ring would have been the kind of preparations for then entering one of the specific areas. Each discipline would be led by a different master of form, who is more perhaps what you might think of as the visual artist, the sculptor or the painter, and a master of craft who is more of a technician. And students were meant to learn from both of these masters. The Bauhaus, one of the kind of things I think that Catherine and I very much felt we wanted to underscore with this exhibition at the Barbican was that it was an art school. It wasn't a lot of people say, oh, it's a design movement, or they think of the Bauhaus. I mean, these kind of chairs that we're sitting on, I think they're copies of Eames chairs, or maybe they are reissues of Eames chairs, might be considered Bauhaus. Not quite, but it shows you that it has the word Bauhaus even has a huge kind of impact on the imaginary. But ultimately, we felt that we wanted to make an exhibition that connected with artists today, and to bring the Bauhaus, in some ways, animate its history through the kind of access to a lot of the archive materials, but also the objects. And one of the things I should also mention about the three Bauhaus collections is that they each had different kind of strengths In Weimar, it was quite object-based from the school's early history because the Bauhaus was based there from the 1919 to 1924 or 25. But then it moved to a new campus in Dessau, which really formed its kind of the modernist look of the school, and also the curriculum started to shift at that point. And then in the last year, it relocated to Berlin. So one of the first teachers appointed by Gropius was Johannes Itten. And Itten was an educator and an artist, a sculptor primarily, but he was also an adherent of a kind of mystical philosophy called Mazdaznen. And I think some of this kind of philosophy both related to his educational ideas. He was a firm believer in Froebel's idea of education through play, but also Mazdaznen had certain kind of things to adhere to, like they had a very strict diet, there was a way of dressing. I think a lot of people didn't cut their hair. So this kind of early Bauhaus had this sort of almost what kind of prototypical hippie aesthetic, let's say. But I think one of the things that Itten brilliantly did was introduce the kind of mixing of play, work, and also party. So throughout the 14 years of the Bauhaus school, these things always went hand in hand. And for an international endeavor that only lasted, that has had an international impact, but only lasted 14 years. That's a very short amount of time given, experimenters already 10. The Bauhaus in a very short period of time had a tremendous impact on arts education. In the Weimar period, there was plenty of celebrations. I think this was a way of bringing people together. Two of the regular celebrations were the Kite Festival and the Lantern Festival, where all the students made kites and flew them, so quite fanciful designs. And the Lantern Festival, which I think took place in the winter solstice, and they floated boats down the river with little candles in them. The Cooper Union, I'm not sure if they still do this, it's an art school in New York, but one of the student assignments is to create some kind of way of, without any kind of mechanical device, of getting an egg from an upper floor of the school down to the ground. So that could be a balloon, that could be a kite. I think a lot of these ideas maybe, have been translated over generations into arts education today. But play was very much at heart in the school's ethos. 5 minutes?
15.
Okay. And then 1923 was a turning point in the school's history. It was one of the years that they were about to kind of embark on a new adventure. Weimar had a lot of pressure, was a conservative town, and Gropius, even though he was a celebrated war hero, was pressured by the local authorities to rein back the school's teachers and students. They were considered too Oriental hippies. They were considered also to be it was a high proportion of Jewish students and a lot of women. And this raised eyebrows in this conservative German town, as did some of the new directions at the school. Teachers like Kandinsky and Moholy-Nagy joined in the early 20s and began advocating for more streamlined aesthetic. So the kind of traditional image of the Bauhaus as being about geometry, being about design, started to have an impact. But also Gropius wanted to advance some of this and started collaborating with industry. He worked with the school students while they didn't have an architecture program. His own private practice started designing model homes and also products for market to support the school. The school was always underfunded. The students often went hungry. So some of the workshops, like the weaving workshop and also the woodworking workshop, started coming up with products like this block set here by Alma Seedhoff, that started to bring income to the school. And I think it also brought some tension because the masters of the weaving program or the woodworking program would not have been the famous masters, and it maybe created a bit of a power dynamic. The Bauhaus was also always had to advocate for its own position, and one of the sections of the exhibition was called Instruments of Communication, and it was really in some ways an effort to create a visible identity, or what we know as a brand today. They had a strong graphics program. Moholy-Nagy led that, and Herbert Bayer was an important student who took an increasingly important role in this. They made publications, they did all kinds of invitations, and you can kind of see the change in aesthetic already. It's quite photographic, it has more of a constructivist aesthetic, and much more kind of clean, not the hand-drawn kind of postcards we see from a couple years ago. But they were also doing things like designing banknotes for the state bank of the local region. And that was because Germany was already entering a period of hyperinflation. So there was increasing financial pressure on the school, and the currency was very devalued, and they had to design new banknotes of increasing value in order to make payments and transactions. So after this period of in Weimar, and Gropius was eventually, and the school was forced out of the town. They were invited by Hans Juncker, who was the aircraft manufacturer in Dessau, to relocate there because it was a kind of a town that was trying to bring new industry, and they saw the Bauhaus as being a kind of center for design. In the lower right, there's Gropius's designs for the new school. The new campus of the school, with its multiple buildings and also different types of architecture, particularly that involve rooftops and balconies, afforded all kinds of gathering places for students. This is the terrace on the left-hand side of the student canteen, and it's photographed from above. So really the building became a place for communal gatherings and all kinds of activity. Most of the programs continued, although some of the more maybe traditional ones, like woodworking, eventually disappeared. But as I mentioned earlier, some of the more handicraft, or what was considered handicraft workshops, like the weaving workshop, which made textiles and wall coverings, became quite an important financial but a mechanism for the Bauhaus. And that was originally led by Georg Mucke, who was a male teacher. There were no female masters in the beginning years, even though there were, I think, more female enrollees in the early years of the Bauhaus. Gropius apparently said that he had to set up the weaving workshop to accommodate all the women students because he didn't want them necessarily to go into some of the more kind of design areas or painting or sculpture. But eventually, the weaving workshop had also its first female master, which was Gunther Stolzel. Here's her student ID card, and she crosses out student, and first she was appointed junior master and then eventually master. But the weaving workshop was always considered a kind of ghetto for the female students. Oskar Schlemmer, who was one of the leading Bauhaus masters and became an important artist in the post-Bauhaus era, apparently said that where there's wool, there's women you will find weaving just to pass the time, as if weaving was a kind of leisure time activity of little merit. Schlemmer did have an important or huge outsized impact on the school's history. he initiated a performance and theater program, and the Bauhaus building itself was often used as a staging ground for these performances that took place on terraces, rooftops, or were often viewed from above. He also, in his courses, designed all kinds of modernist costumes and mounted this important triadic ballet during his tenure at the Bauhaus. But the Bauhaus also had much more kind of informal activity. The students, a group of students, formed the Bauhaus band, and they performed at many of the school's functions, like the White Party or the Metal Party, these important gatherings that the school would be later known for. Maybe what's more kind of known now today of the school's legacy is its design role. But it wasn't always that the visual artists were doing the fine art work and the designers were doing the chairs and tables. There was often a kind of collaboration or competition sometimes between various students. In this case, Josef Elbers and Marcel Breuer, they both were designing prototypical chairs and nesting tables. And 5 more minutes, okay. Besides performance and design, an important legacy of the Bauhaus was photography. Photography was a brand new medium, and it was actually pioneered by some of the women teachers, or the women students. Lucia Maholi was one of them. But the women rarely got to do the more experimental work. They often did the photography for the catalogs of the school to promote the furniture or the design, whereas Lucia's later husband, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, would get to run the photography course as well as do more experimental modes of photography. So he really kind of experimented with things like the photogram and double exposures, cameraless photography, but also this sort of what was called new vision photography of working with various views from above, worm's eye view, bird's eye view, and things like this. And because the school's architecture afforded these views, a lot of this photography circulated quite widely in the late 20s. By 1931, the Bauhaus in Dessau had to close. Again, there were similar pressures of, it was seen as a communist stronghold, ideas outside the West were promoted there. It was accused of being a bastion for Jews. So the Bauhaus left, and also the previous 2 directors, Gropius had already left by then, and Hannes Meyer, who was also an architect, resigned, and Mies van der Rohe, another architect, took over. He moved the Bauhaus to Berlin, and then it was only lasted there for a number of months. Mounting pressures from the National Socialists ultimately forced the school to close. They attempted to control the curriculum and also force Mies van der Rohe to fire the Jewish and foreign teachers. But this ultimately led to the school's closing in 1932, and then ultimately the international dispersal of many of the faculty and students, which would then go on to have worldwide and international repercussions, most notably perhaps to Chicago and other parts of the US where similar type programs are set up, but also places like Argentina and Japan and Israel would have important Bauhaus legacies. Whitechapel Gallery, much smaller institution. In fact, it precedes the Bauhaus, and some of the kind of ethos of the Whitechapel Gallery in the early years were very much in line with the Bauhaus School. It was meant to be a learning institution. The Whitechapel was founded by local religious and philanthropic and social leaders. The building on the left is the original gallery, built in 1901, and the adjoining building on the right, which is now incorporated as part of the Whitechapel Gallery, was the old Whitechapel Library. The neighborhood was largely immigrant. at the turn of the century and often illiterate. So the library was seen as a place for learning, and then the gallery was a picture gallery, which also meant that moral messages or stories could be told through painting, for example. One of the things that I think is very different about the Whitechapel versus the Barbican is that it's a much smaller scale institution and has a number of types of spaces. Has a very strong education program. We work very closely with artists on commissioning new projects. We have an important archive. It's not a collecting institution, so there's no collection of artwork, but there is an archive that dates back to 1901. We also host collections from around the world. What we aren't able to do, maybe spatially, we do over time, so we're able to go back to these resources time and again. And one of the important parts of the Whitechapel program is working with living artists, and in particular, often developing work in close discussion with them. I invited Leonore Antunes to do a project. I think probably I started discussions with her in 2015 for a project in 2017. She made a site visit. She had done one show in London, perhaps I think about 10 years prior. She was very interested in architecture, particularly Erno Goldfinger, who is a modernist architect who designed 2 important housing estates. And also he was participated in an important exhibition at the Whitechapel called This Is Tomorrow in 1956, which paired artists with painters and sculptors to collaborate and speculate about perhaps the future directions in art. Leonore was interested in this exhibition, in Goldfinger's work, but she was also interested in excavating some of the forgotten or lesser known figures from that exhibition and also from Britain's modernist history. So she looked in our archive, found a number of materials. The structure on the lower right is part of an installation or part of the project that Alison and Peter Smithson, Nigel Henderson, and Eduardo Palazzi realized for that 1956 exhibition. Their project was called Patio and Pavilion, and they really foregrounded this notion of the as found. So it was kind of like in line, I think, with the idea of the found object, although that discourse hadn't been articulated yet. So the as found was taking a situation or material from your local environment and using it as found. So a lot of the objects that that group of architects and artists introduced were things found in the streets of East London, for example, that you see on the rooftop of the pavilion. This kind of patio and pavilion idea also led to a house that Smithson's designed in the upper right. It's called the Upper Lawn Pavilion or the Solar Pavilion. They found a plot of land that had an existing wall and built around the house around the wall. So it was kind of a patio with a pavilion within. And this is a photograph that Leonore found in the, not in our archives, but in the Reba photographic archives. And it looked to me very much like the Bauhaus, a view of people dining, the Smithsons, along with the architecture critic Rainer Banham, dining on the Upper Lawn Pavilion. So the two figures that she chose to focus on, and Leonore's practice is very much about engaging with the overlooked figures of modern art and design, and particularly women. One of these was Mary Martin, and 2 out of the 3, there were 3 women participants in this 1956 exhibition. All the others out of the, I think there were 37 in total, were men. And 2 out of the 3 women were wives of other participants. So perhaps they wouldn't have been invited if it wasn't for their husbands. But Mary Martin participated with Kenneth Martin and alongside an architect called John Weeks, and they design this structure that I think they just called environment. And initially we assumed that Weeks was the one who came up with the architecture, but one of the things as part of the research we discovered is that Mary Martin made this maquette on the upper right for the pavilion or the structure, and she, I think, was very much responsible for the design. Here's a floor, a later drawing. She made permutations of 8, which also inspired Leonore's ideas. So Leonore made this installation with multiple components. The floor design is derived from Mary Martin's drawing, and then the kind of sculptural elements using natural materials like rope and wood and leather, but also metal, are from architectural motifs, either from the Smithson's house or from the Goldfinger house, or from Mary Martin's drawings. So 2 more views. The space has natural skylights and was only lit with either the natural light or lights that Leonore designed. So it was constantly changing over the course of the day, depending on time of year and the amount of natural light and time of day. Am I probably more or less out of time? Okay. Maybe, hopefully we can introduce some of the issues around the other project, which kind of takes off from here in discussion.
Thanks, Lydia. I wanted to start a little bit with the Bauhaus exhibition, and it felt like you also gave this sort of expansive kind of history of some of the important documents and works and the pedagogic model, which is very useful for the audience, of course. For those of us who are more familiar with this material, really, also thought it important to highlight the fact that with the Bauhaus 100th anniversary year, which just passed, there's also a little bit of a Bauhaus fatigue. And there's this sort of overproduction of a certain kind of linear narrative of the Bauhaus, to be honest, and it has nothing to do with the importance and value of that methodology. In fact, some of these elements of playfulness and the role of the way that gender and etc. sort of are investigated in the way you narrated was very, very crucial. But just that one of the ways in which another set of curators, Grant Watson and Marion von Osten, and I want to mention this because Grant Watson has been a guest here at the Hub, the way they dealt with the Bauhaus Imaginista project at the House of World Cultures and in many other locations in the world was truly pioneering effort. Because in fact, it decentralized the Bauhaus. And it started with the international dispersal, in a sense. So in every place it went to, it looked at very important pedagogic models that are starting from, like there was a photograph of Iwao Yamawaki that Lydia shared, and Iwao and his partner were students at the Bauhaus, but then they also, when they went back to Japan, there was the Institute for the Life Configurations in Tokyo in 1931. That was one of these sort of outcomes, and they had a journal, etc. And there was a lot of these aspects really were shared through the Bauhaus Imaginista project when they had an iteration of the exhibition in Kyoto and a conference in Tokyo, which I was part of. And further, they also looked really close to this context at Shantiniketan, which also had its 100-year anniversary. And really looked at resonances between Bauhaus and Shantiniketan as well as Sriniketan. There was a conference on NID as a model, and again, certain parallels with the National Institute of Design, and all of those were explored, and it feels as though just from a kind of curatorial practice that this kind of expanded approach to seminal parts of European modernity is perhaps the future of such topics. So that was just more a commentary, but maybe if you could tell us a little bit more about how you staged the exhibition. Because what was great is also you talked a bit about the program, and you all investigated art education in the UK context, but could you tell us more about what the exhibition looked like?
Yes, the exhibition was arranged over 2 floors of the gallery. The gallery has this open space, as I mentioned, with on the upper level 8 rooms, and then on the lower space, a very kind of big dramatic double height space with a couple of rooms on the side. So one of the ideas was really to take advantage of the physical space and to work with views from above and from below, which is very much something that the Bauhaus students were doing in Dessau in their new campus. But it's also like because the space is divided into these kind of rooms in some ways with one open area, it lends itself to kind of some sort of narrative or being able to present the material in small groupings. So I think the architecture it precipitated some of the decisions around how to tell the story of the Bauhaus. So there is quite a linear way of navigating the space. But also some of the things like the performance-based work, or there were projections that you could look at from the ground up, projected on some of these walls. We worked with architects Karmodi Grok, who kind of transformed the space. The architecture of the Barbican Center is this heavy, brutalist architecture, which some artists find quite difficult, and sometimes curators find quite difficult as well. And architects often have the tendency to either cover up the architecture a bit or to use it as a support for other things, in which case Karmodi Grok did, to make these walls that would then hold large-scale images, kind of contextual images. So if you saw a group of objects from the school, you might see the classroom in which they were made in a kind of backdrop photograph.
And coming to Leonore Antunes's work, which perhaps you had to rush through that segment of your presentation. So just thought perhaps it would be beneficial just to go into her working approach as somebody who is constantly learning different artisanal techniques. Because this is quite a labor in itself, really. Because with Leonore, almost every body of work is, on the one hand, this sort of inquiry into design and architectural histories, also very consciously of gendered histories in this field, but also teaching herself and members of her studio techniques that have, here working with hemp and leather and all of these materials, and then engaging with the architecture of the site differently each time, which she also did actually in the Gropius Bau, considering it's the history of that building. So if you could share more.
Well, commissioning an artist is quite a different process than working on any type of loan-based exhibition. One of the first things that Leonore said when she came to make a site visit is, "You're not going to leave, are you?" I think she had 2 experiences of being invited to make new work for different institutions in which the curator left. And when you're meant to work very closely with artist and curator, to suddenly have that other interlocutor disappear, it can be quite traumatic. So I reassured her, no, that wasn't going to happen. And in fact, we spent a tremendous amount of time working on the research. We made trips around Britain to look in archives. We went to the Henry Moore Institute to look at material by Mary Martin, for example. We also went to Pallant House in Chichester to look at the Catherine Pettigrew collection of British constructivists, which was then on view and included some of the artists that Leonore was interested in. Leonore would come back for other trips to go visit and look at the Smithson's house or the Goldfinger house, take measurements. Yeah, really it had to be a very, kind of ongoing dialogue. And then also on the practical side of producing the work, some of it as Natasha mentioned, she and her studio team made by hand, but other elements, she works very closely with a number of craftspeople, and a part of her practice is also to keep those traditions alive. So the leather worker, and I think also the person who does some of her work with wood, and somebody who works with the material of the cork on the floor, are from her native Portugal, and she collaborates with them again and again so that they'll have other kinds of work, because the types of craft that they're doing now aren't that applicable in a kind of larger market. So she's as much interested in reviving kind of the history behind certain women artists, but also behind craft techniques from other eras. We did find a number of people in Britain for her to work with. In particular, we had to figure out how to make this quite complicated floor, which required her sending us various designs and then having them translated for a CNC machine. There's two different kinds of material, cork and linoleum, and it was quite a jigsaw that had to be cut in a certain way, and then the linoleum, the black linoleum, inlaid into the cork flooring. So yeah, it's, everything from the research end to the production end. It's important to kind of have a close dialogue with the artist about these sort of things, what their intention is, what outcomes they want, and how to do it together.
And if we go into just perhaps the outline of Is This Tomorrow, mm-hmm. especially in the way that it becomes a kind of experiment really in dealing with exhibition history and institutional history at the same time?
Mm-hmm. Yes, many artists have been interested in the Whitechapel's exhibition history. So, for example, we're fortunate to be able to show Picasso's Guernica on a tour in the late 30s to help raise funds and attention for the Spanish Republican cause. But also we've had important shows, as I mentioned yesterday, in the 1950s that were possibly supported by the U.S. Information Agency, of Pollock, Rothko, and others. Yeah, we've also done these kind of more experimental shows over time, and the archive is really a testament to that, and that's one of the first things most artists want to do when they come to Whitechapel is look into this archive, because they've often heard of some exhibition in the history of the gallery. Elio Oiticica did an important exhibition in 1969 called the Whitechapel Experiment. Frida Kahlo had an important early show there. A lot of artists, have something in mind that they'd like to research. But also as a curator, you look at that history, and Leonore, like looking through some of the documents from This Is Tomorrow, made it quite apparent that this was a rich subject that I think any artist or architect would want to touch on today. A couple of years later, I mounted this exhibition called Is This Tomorrow, which returned to this model of asking artists and architects to work together to make new work. So again, a commission type project, but one in which there were 10 pairings of artists and architects collaborating. I can quickly run through some of the projects. If you want to, I can talk while I'm...
Yeah, I think these are really great examples. I mean, if there's anything specific, you just want to say a few words about some of them?
Okay. Maybe start here. The structure for putting this exhibition together was to start conversations with artists on the one hand and architects on the other. And this was, I think, quite different than the original model, where artists were already meeting regularly with architects, largely through regular meetings at the Institute of Contemporary Art. People like Palazzi and the Smithsons had a regular dialogue. So it was a sort of self-generated exhibition, the earlier version, whereas this one was almost the opposite in some ways. It was asking artists or architects, would they like to collaborate with somebody, and who might that somebody be? In some cases, they had specific ideas. In other cases, it was a sort of arranged marriage, or and of course, they had opportunity to meet the potential collaborator before deciding. So this, by way of example, is Andres Jaque, who's a Spanish architect based between Spain and the US, who runs a office or practice called Office for Political Innovation. He ended up collaborating with Jacoby Satterwhite on this project called Spirits Roaming the Earth. And sometimes you think the artist is the one who generates the content, because artists are often in a more kind of position to narrate, tell stories, research, whereas architecture often has to work to client specifications. But in this case, Andres had a story that he had written about tying all kinds of things together, like high-end commercial real estate development in New York City, with how New York City achieves its clean air goals by getting energy from the Pennsylvania Valley through fracking, but also how this high-end real estate is very much now the site for queer hookups. And they brought these concerns together through this text that Andres had written, and Jacoby made a series of films that enacted these scenarios on the screens. Rana Begum and Marina Tabassum. Rana's Bangladeshi origin artist based in London, and Marina's based in Dhaka. They wanted to collaborate around certain kind of shared concerns for geometry, for architecture, for space, for also kind of introducing natural elements in architecture. So they designed this structure that in fact kind of looked like a blank facade from one direction, but had a narrow opening into this room where there was an oculus above that let light in from a skylight and illuminated relief that Rana designed for the oculus. And yeah, so this was kind of an example of there were already shared interests, and they kind of took those shared interests and found a way to make something that furthered their interests. Simon Fujiwara and David Cohn. I think this project was probably driven a lot by Simon's interests in kind of spectacle and contemporary life, and particular at the moment when he started thinking about this project, the Leonardo work, the Salvator Mundi, was very much in the news and had sort of just disappeared after being auctioned for a record price. And Simon kind of made this futuristic idea for a museum, which David Cohn realized as a model. So Simon came up with this kind of tale of how the Salvator Mundi kind of went from being a kind of second-rate painting that was found in somebody's home to being elevated to an auction record, and ultimately, this kind of media spectacle around it.
I just want to just check if there are questions from the audience.
We're here in Calcutta, where the so-called or a so-called Bauhaus exhibition took place in 1922. It wasn't called as such, which brought together works by some of the Bauhaus artists, from Klee to Kandinsky, Feininger, Itten, who you mentioned, and it brought these together with Indian artists. And as you know, a few years ago, the Bauhaus Dessau tried to restage that exhibition, which raised a few challenges because the list of works. Its titles are vague. Some of the works were difficult to locate, but anyway, it was a very important exercise, if only in raising this, bringing this to the attention of an international audience. That sort of brings me back to the great comment that Hal Foster made and that you quoted, and the disconnect perhaps sometimes between ideas and objects. And more broadly, I wanted to ask you, pertaining to the Bauhaus exhibition, in which ideas, of course, are so important, but maybe you want to answer in regard to another exhibition where the ideas were there, you wanted to engage with them, but somehow perhaps the objects weren't. And in the case of the Bauhaus show, perhaps at a more practical level, if only because of the competition with other exhibitions that you mentioned as well.
Well, the Bauhaus exhibition, we were able to draw, as I mentioned, from the collections of these three institutions, but not only the collections, but also the knowledge of the expert collection managers and curators and researchers from each of the institutions. This took place in 2012, and this was after the Martin Gropius Bau and MoMA exhibitions, probably the first time that there was this kind of joint effort to collaborate. But those three collections also don't hold a lot of the kinds of work you're mentioning, the fine art objects, some of which we had to borrow from other institutions. And as a non-collecting institution, it's often a challenge to borrow work when you don't have a collection to reciprocate with. So yes, in the end, we were able to borrow a number of works by like Clay and Kandinsky and others, but it took a lot of negotiation and working with extensive amounts of couriers and things like this that are kind of the practical side of mounting an exhibition that you don't see. And you don't really want to see either. So in that instance, there were loans available, and also because there were many possibilities for, if a lot of this is print material, graphic material, there's multiple copies. If a good one wasn't in one of the three collections, the V&A might have had it, or other institutions. So in a kind of historical show where you don't need one specific thing, it can be easier. There are other choices. But yes, loan exhibitions when you need a particular work to make a certain point and you can't get it, you sometimes have to tell the story in another way, I guess.
I had a question about audiences and engagement. Both the Bauhaus and This Is Tomorrow, Is This Tomorrow are sort of premised on ideas of experimentation, openness, collaboration, and are essentially both kind of open formats. What did it mean to kind of put them into the particular context of the Barbican and its location and its history and the Whitechapel, and how did you engage publics? Was it perhaps more difficult because they were unlike, let's say, a typical artist-led exhibition, or was it perhaps made easier, or were there like more possibilities because of the particular new formats that they were presenting? So what kind of engagements did they allow for?
Well, at the Barbican, the Bauhaus exhibition at the time, I think had a record number of visitors, which was something like 110,000, which is quite good for a Barbican exhibition. It's a ticketed show, so that's quite significant. And it was also during the year of the Olympics, during that summer period in London, where a lot of people thought, tourism for non-Olympic things was going to be down, or Londoners were going to try to avoid going out because of traffic and other things. But it at the time, I think, set a new record for a Barbican exhibition. But I also think that's partly down to the brand Bauhaus. People know or think they know what the Bauhaus might have been, and and also perhaps because of the multidisciplinary audiences at the Barbican, it's something that they may have heard of in another context. wasn't a huge challenge in terms of audience outreach. What it is maybe more of a challenge or a great difference between the Barbican and the Whitechapel is the kind of education and program. The Barbican is kind of more driven by music. The education department is shared between multiple art forms, so there's not an art specialist in that team. They are more keen on doing things either for a very general audience or that might be like a school's audience on a particular subject and largely music related. So in that regard, it was more of a challenge to mount a kind of public program. We did invite a number of people like Peter Fischli to talk about the Bauhaus legacy and some of his work in Switzerland, or we had some of the descendants of some of the artists do talks, things like that. But yeah, there isn't a natural kind of dialogue with the education or public programming team there. And conversely, at the Whitechapel, it's probably the exact opposite. There's a very kind of voracious public for talks and other kinds of events. And each, I think probably have 2 to 3 public programs per week at Whitechapel. They might be exhibition related or they might be more broadly about art. We have a terrific series about exhibition histories where speakers come and talk about an exhibition that they've mounted or that made a big impact on them, to kind of look at key moments in exhibition making. So yeah, for Is This Tomorrow, we had a symposium where almost all of the participants who were available, I think probably at least 8 out of the 10 groups took part in it on the Saturday following the opening. So.
Last question.
I don't think.
Two very small queries. One is taking from Natasha's cue that some of the exhibitions looked into this very perceived history of the Bauhaus in terms of institutional practice, how it kind of, like NID kind of professes to be taking a lot of model from Bauhaus in its sense. Also the resonance of, for example, Shantiniketan in its, but it was not taking from it. There is certain correspondences in terms of letters and correspondence between Gropius and Rabindranath, but it was 2 different schools which were happening parallelly, which has certain similarities, without not saying that they are similar. Mm-hmm. That will be a little bit too much. But my question is 2 things. One is that I have read about that Bauhaus also, the food program was very important for the Bauhaus model. And
the which program?
The food program, how they ate food, where they got their food from, and they started, working on gardening, growing crops for themselves so that they can supplement their foods. Was there something as a material that came up in the exhibition? That is one. Another question is, which is more like Bauhaus as a design school, partially a design school, I wouldn't go to that extent, has its models which are used, which are for utilitarian purposes, whether it's Breuer's model, whether it's the housing they started, and so on. So was it a way that suddenly these objects are again being deified, they are made into deities, or they are made into objects, rather than objects to be made into objects that has to be looked at, rather than objects that can be utilized? Because in an exhibition context, sometimes they become objects which has to be looked with a certain degree of dignity, certain degree of reification, certain degree of, like a cult value. So was there a way to kind of not get into that trope? This is, yeah. Thank you.
On the first subject about the Bauhaus and food, one of the contributors to the catalog, Nicholas Fox-Weber, who is a scholar of a number of the biographer as well of some of the lead figures of the Bauhaus, did write a text about some of the things you're talking about, how they grew their food, what kind of diet they had, periods where there was food shortages, and so on. So, and also how the kind of Bauhaus canteen when they were in Dessau changed the dynamic at the school. So food was something certainly thought about, and I think, is something in any culture that brings people together. So yeah, that was one of the things we did want to address, at least maybe not so directly because there wasn't firsthand material like a menu or any kind of direct evidence, that we decided to commission a writer to address that topic. In regards to kind of the reification of objects, it is hard to, I think in the way we tried to do this is to make it seem like a kind of living and working environment where students had this kind of very lively extracurricular as well as the curricular life. When you're, borrowing important objects, historical objects from a museum, generally they can't be touched or handled. They certainly can't be sat on, and at least in Britain, there's this kind of, the way you ensure exhibitions is through this government indemnity scheme, and you do have to kind of adhere to certain kind of safety and security principles. So yes, in that regard, it's not possible. You can go, for example, go to the Berlin Bauhaus archive. I was quite surprised that they were drinking tea and coffee in the archive reading room, and you could also go into the archives, make an appointment, and look at a lot of this material firsthand. So I think archives are one way you have a kind of closer relationships to some of the material and are able to handle it in outside of a museum context.
We're going to go into the next presentation by Zoe Hutt.